So, I've already made my list for the worst and most disappointing video games of the past decade. So now I'm going to discuss what I consider to be the best games, the best released games of the 2010s. Similar to the first list, there's just 10 games up on this list, 10 entries. I do have a list of honorable mentions for both lists, but due to the sake of time and sanity during the editing process, as well as the actual length of the video itself, I will not be discussing my honorable mentions. And of course, just like the first list, every single game on this list is something that I've played to completion. And a lot of these games I've replayed, or I've played extensively over time. And I'll probably mention that throughout the course of the video. At number 10, God of War 3. So, this is a game that I first played on the PlayStation 3, and then I later bought the remaster for a discounted price. And I platinumed the game twice, once on the PlayStation 3 and once again on the PlayStation 4. Even going on 10 years later, this game still holds up today. This is one of the best action video games of all time. It's one of the best hack and slash video games of all time. And the game just hits you from the moment the gameplay begins all the way through to the end of the game. And the story is pretty straightforward. Kratos, he wants revenge against the gods. And the way the boss fights are set up in this game is pretty unique. There was a lot of encounters that I still remember from this game, and I have a lot of favorite moments from God of War 3, including the boss fight with Kronos, Hades, Poseidon. And the game really succeeds because of, once again, responsive controls and placing an emphasis on good timing. Now, of course, action-based video games have taken a much different direction over the course of the decade, mainly due to the Dark Souls games. And so you don't see a whole lot of games like this anymore with just the standard hack and slash games like God of War, the older God of War games. That's a shame. And that's a big reason why this game is on my list. The reason it's not any higher up on my list is because really the story kind of fizzled out towards the end and it didn't really stick the landing that it should have. And perhaps I'll make a video about that later at some point. But that's my number 10, God of War 3. At number 9, Resident Evil 7. So, like I was saying in my worst and most disappointing video, Resident Evil 6 was the final nail in the coffin for me when it came to the Resident Evil franchise. I was done with the series. I did not want to support Capcom anymore. And then this game came out, and it was getting all of these high review scores. And I had already played the demo for Resident Evil 7 before the game came out, and I didn't really see what people were really anticipating. But I took a chance, and I bought the game basically a day after the initial release. I ended up really loving this game. And it's all because Capcom decided to do the smart thing, the wise thing, and they returned to what made the series great. They returned to the basics and they got rid of all the action elements. But at the same time, they were clever and they provided something new with the first-person perspective. So everything about Resident Evil was there. Everything that made the series great was in this game, including the safe houses, the herbs, the puzzle design, all of that was in this game. But the setting was extremely unique with this house that's kind of secluded in the countryside. And then if you read the files throughout the game, it really connects to the other Resident Evil games without directly referencing any of the popular characters from the series. And so Capcom did a really damn good job with this game. And I'm very excited to see where they're going to take this. Like, Resident Evil 7 shouldn't be a one and done type of thing. I would like to see them continue this for Resident Evil 8. And I would like to see the Ethan and the Mia characters return. Fantastic game. One of the generation's absolute best releases. At number 8, Resident Evil 2. So Capcom, they were coming off of a very strong 2017 with Resident Evil 7. And then they released this last year in 2019. And this really raised the bar for remakes. If a gaming company is going to develop a remake of an older classic game, they have to modernize it in a way that fits the modern market, obviously. But they also have to pay homage to the original. So the entire project connects with both old fans while at the same time reaching a new audience. And this game did that flawlessly. And of course, this went back to the third-person perspective and provided the over-the-shoulder perspective that was popularized in Resident Evil 4. But it removed all the action elements of Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6. And what you got was a very campy, more classic style survival horror game. But what really made this work was Capcom's emphasis on replayability. Like many of the other Resident Evil games, this game was designed around the concept of, you play it once the first time and then you're encouraged to replay the game again, and things will be different the second time versus the first time that you played the game. And the rewards for completing certain challenges is worth it enough to perfect your playthrough. And that's something I find really attractive about this game. Like I said, Capcom raised the bar with this game. From now on, when it comes to remakes, no matter the game, if any future remake isn't as good as the Resident Evil 2 remake, then it's not worth anyone's time. And it's certainly not worth my time. So now I will move on to my number 7. At number 7, I have SpiderMan on PS4. And this game was developed by one of my all-time favorite video game development studios, Insomniac Games. Now, I grew up playing Ratchet and Clank. That has to be my favorite video game franchise of all time. And I love the way Insomniac tackles their projects. They're a very diverse developer. They never restrain themselves to one specific genre, and they're always doing something new that they haven't done before. And so this was really kind of a dream project for them, it seems. And this is also a dream game for me. And I think it was the same way for a lot of other fans of the character. Spider-Man has always been my favorite superhero, and I've played a lot of different games based on the Spider-Man character. And there's been some pretty good ones, such as Spider-Man 2, based on the Sam Raimi film of the same name, Ultimate Spider-Man, which came out back in the mid-2000s. And none of the Spider-Man games have really reached this level of quality. Now, this game does borrow a lot from Batman Arkham, the Batman Arkham games, but it does so in a way to where it's not blatantly just copying every single unique aspect from the Batman Arkham series. They just took the basics of the gameplay from those games, and they provided a unique spin that fits the Spider-Man character. And it really paid off in the end. This is absolutely one of the best games that I've played on the PlayStation 4. It's one of the best 8th generation games, and it's one of the best superhero games of all time. And quite frankly, I would say it's the best Spider-Man game ever made. Definitely deserving of being in my top 10. And speaking of Batman Arkham, my number 6 pick is Batman Arkham City. Now, this is a very unique game. This game is actually in my top 10 list of all time for video games. Playing this game for the first time was like some kind of strange euphoria for me. Because behind Spider-Man, Batman is my second favorite superhero. And I grew up watching Batman the Animated Series. And playing this felt like a lost episode of Batman the Animated Series. And it was very crazy because they had the voice actors from that show portraying the characters in this game. They had Kevin Conroy as Batman. They had Mark Hamill as the Joker. They had these legendary voice actors portraying these characters. But then what really made this unique was this game had this unique structure to where it was an open world environment, but everything felt inclusive. Nothing felt restrictive at all. You could go inside certain buildings, and the game would never stop you and tell you, no, you have to go do this first. You could choose to tackle certain side missions completely independent of the main story itself. And the game just had that freedom to it. And then when you add in the combat challenges and the extra playable characters such as Robin, Nightwing, Catwoman, it just raised the game to that apex level. And Batman Arkham City is really the game that cemented the Batman Arkham series as one of the best video game franchises of all time. And so many games have tried to emulate the combat system in Rocksteady's games. And we've had some good imitators such as SpiderMan on PS4 or the Middle Earth games, or even that Mad Max game that came out a few years ago. But none of them have done that combat system as good as Rocksteady. And like I said, this is one of my all-time favorite video games. And my list would be incomplete without it. At number 5, I have Injustice 2 on my list. And this is the only fighting game that I have on my list. NetherRealm really did something unique with this game. Very special. It's something that I've never really seen from a fighting game. With the gear system that they had in this game, they added RPG elements to the gameplay. So every fight that you play in the game, you obtain this loot. And you can customize the characters to have these unique appearances. But the special thing is that it wasn't just customization just for the sake of customization. The gear pieces actually made the characters stronger, and then they had different attributes. You could increase a character's defense, their offense, how much damage they dish out. You could increase the strength of a character's individual special abilities. And then you could take these characters, your customized characters, online and fight against other people. And that's something that I haven't really seen done in any other fighting game. And it's because of the customization system as well as the well-made multiverse mode that I was able to get a solid 200 plus hours out of this game before I ever even touched the online. And after I had my fill of the single player portion of the game, I went online and I had tons of different fights with different players. And by that point, my skill level was high enough after playing the game so long that I ended up having a lot more fun with the game than I probably would have had I jumped online like right from the start. And I've had a lot of unique fights playing Injustice 2 with other people, as well as the CPU. It's a very special game, and NetherRealm, there's something very interesting with NetherRealm Studios, the way they design their games. They're easy enough to pick up and play for anybody, but if you really want to get good at them, they have the technicality to them, but they also have enough depth to where, players don't play a certain character the same way. And Injustice 2 did that better than any other fighting game that I've seen this past decade. And that's why it's on my list. At number 4 is Persona 5. This is easily, hands down, the best RPG that has been released over the past decade. I've played a lot of different RPG games that have been released over the past several years, and not a single one comes even close to being on the same level as Persona 5. Not Final Fantasy 15, not Fallout 4, not The Witcher 3, not any of the Dark Souls games, not Bloodborne, nothing comes close to being anywhere near as good as Persona 5. What makes Persona 5 unique is it has a very mature level of storytelling, which is something that really surprised me. But it also has good pacing. And that's saying something because the game is 100 plus hours long. It took me 105 hours to beat this game. And it's a social simulator, but it's an interesting one because they have well-written characters in the game. And the more time you spend with the characters in the game, the more you want them to succeed in their goal. And that makes the story in the game more interesting. And so I didn't really mind the length, despite the fact that it really does take a lot of patience to play something like this. This isn't for your average gamer. This is for the hardcore crowd. And this is for people who are open-minded. And I almost skipped this game entirely due to the fanboyism that was going on in the fan base. Some of the comments that I read online were really turning me off from this game when this game was coming out. But fortunately, I did end up deciding to buy the game, and I played it, and I love it. It's fantastic. I love it so much that I'm going to rebuy this for full price. And that's something I would never do. Persona 5 is extremely good. It's something that I've never really experienced on this level before when it comes to RPG games. And I'm definitely going to have to make a video at some point in the future, probably a retrospective discussing the game in further detail. And so now I'm down to my top 3. At number 3, Horizon Zero Dawn. So this game is high up on my list when it comes to discussing specifically 8th generation games, games that have come out this console generation. This is easily the best console exclusive that has been released this generation over the past several years. And what makes Horizon Zero Dawn great is its attention to detail with the open world environment. Its main character, Aloy, who probably is my favorite protagonist, my favorite modern video game protagonist, and specifically the enemies, the machines, the robots in the game. The combat system is designed in a way to where the game emphasizes you targeting these specific weak points on virtually every single enemy that you encounter in the game. And so the game encourages the player to be methodical and to really think about what they're doing rather than just spamming the attack button at whatever hostile threat comes their way. Then the game also mixes in these RPG elements with the crafting system. And the result is some of the most satisfying combat that I've played all console generation. And then it also helped that the game has a very unique setting. The structure of the open world is done in a way to where it's a big open world game, but unlike games like The Witcher 3 and the last 2 Assassin's Creed games, the game is not bloated with a bunch of boring meandering with all these meaningless side quests. All the side quests in Horizon Zero Dawn are interesting, and the game doesn't waste your time if you want to get something done. And all of those reasons are why Horizon Zero Dawn makes it in my top 3. It is one of the absolute best video games that's been released over the past 10 years. At number 2, I have Mass Effect 2 on my list. And it seems like this game came out in a different time. The BioWare of today is not the same BioWare that released Mass Effect 2. They are not the same company now that they were back then. Mass Effect 2, similar to Batman Arkham City, is in my all-time top 10 list for video games. And when it comes to RPGs in general, this is one of the absolute best RPGs ever made. This is one of the best video games ever made, period. BioWare introduces this idea of this suicide mission, which is really what the game is building towards. This suicide mission where if you do not build your team properly throughout the course of the game, you are going to fail this mission at the end of the game. And that's really how the game is structured. That's how it's set up. You have to build these relationships with these characters, as well as build up your stats throughout the entire game, so you can take on this objective at the end of the game and be successful. And I haven't seen that done in any RPG before Mass Effect 2 or since Mass Effect 2. It's a very unique game in that sense. And also just the art direction, the characters that are well written, the level design, which is immaculate, and the combat system, which takes a more cover shooter approach. It all adds up to a very unique experience. And Mass Effect 2 is a game that I'm going to remember for a long time, for years to come. But it doesn't make my number one for best game of the decade. My number one, similar to the number one on my worst and most disappointing list, is also one of the most highest rated games of the past 10 years. And it's a game that I've replayed multiple times. It's a game that originally came out on the PlayStation 3 and was re-released on the PlayStation 4. And that game is yes, The Last of Us. That is my number one. No other video game I've played has stuck with me more so than this game that I've played this past decade. The Last of Us is a very unique kind of game for the kind of games that are released in the modern market for video games. It's a linear game, it's heavily focused on narrative, and it has very tight controls. So it doesn't really fit in the theme of the kinds of games that are usually made now, which are the very opposite of what this game is. You know, very open, big, massive, and more open to player experimentation. The Last of Us isn't really designed that way. The Last of Us is a game that fits a more classic design style of video games in the past, of past generations. And that's one of the things that I really like about it. But what really elevates this game are these two characters, Joel and Ellie. Joel and Ellie's relationship and the journey that they go on in this game is, quite frankly, some of the best storytelling I've ever seen in a video game. Like storytelling and presentation. That is one thing that Naughty Dog nailed with this game. When it comes to video games, you really don't see storytelling that can really rival movies. It doesn't happen very often. In fact, it's extremely rare to find a video game that has storytelling that rivals some of the best movies that are out there. But this is one of the very few games that's been able to do it. And that's because of its grounded approach. This whole idea surrounding this zombie outbreak, this apocalypse, where people can get affected and turn into these monsters, the clickers. And you have this character, Joel, who loses his daughter at the beginning of the game in a very tragic fashion. And he meets this girl, years later, who turns out to be immune to the virus. And she may very well be the cure that can save all of humanity. And so the entire game is this escort mission that takes place over the course of a year. But the heart of the game is the relationship between these two characters. And Joel and Ellie are two of my favorite video game characters of all time because their relationship feels natural. They don't like each other at all when they first meet. But throughout the course of the game, they become more dependent on each other to survive in this post-apocalyptic world. And they even develop a surrogate parent and child relationship. And it's not something that I've really ever seen in a video game. It's very unique. And there's so many great moments throughout the game, such as when Joel and Ellie meet Sam and Henry, or when they run into David and his band of cannibals, or even at the end of the game when Joel learns that the Fireflies intend to kill Ellie to extract her blood and engineer a cure, and he decides to risk his life to save hers. And the game is written well enough to where even after you experience it the first time, it still holds up, every subsequent playthrough. That's how well written the story is. And then gameplay wise, the gameplay really places an emphasis on stealth and outsmarting the AI, which usually involves pointing the AI to a specific point in the level so you can either sneak past them or pick them off one by one. But not only that, this game also has the best multiplayer mode that I've seen in a video game, in any video game, over the past decade, and that's the Survivors multiplayer mode. That was probably the biggest surprise with this game, was how well done the multiplayer mode was. And you still have people playing it now. There are still people playing the multiplayer mode for The Last of Us even now. And so this is a very unique game all the way around. And I'm not even sure that Naughty Dog can capture lightning in the bottle again with The Last of Us Part 2, which I'm sure is going to be a great game. I just don't know if it's going to be as good as the first one. Obviously, only time will tell. But I've heard many stories of people who do not like video games who have sat and watched other people play through The Last of Us. That just goes to show how special the game really is. Even when the game came out and I was playing through the game for the first time, I remember my brother walking into the room. He took a look at the game and he had stopped playing video games years ago. And he was like, oh shit, that looks crazy right there. And he didn't even know that video games could reach such a cinematic level and still retain enough interactive elements for it to be a fun gameplay experience. And I love this game. It's a very unique game, and that's why it's my number one of the decade. And so that concludes my list, and now I'm going to work on my top 10 worst and best list for movies of the 2010s, and I will be uploading those very soon.